Good afternoon. It's Monday, the 27th of June, 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. And we'll be joined by live video Skype link by David Ellis from Strategic Defence Initiatives. And, well, here we are. We are the Monday after the referendum weekend.
Yes.
Very interesting it was too. More on that in a minute. The weather. Well, we're told the weather in Dubai is hot and particularly humid, whereas across UK it's described as reasonable, which means a little bit of sunshine, quite a lot of cloud, and in a fair few places it's humid here as well. Well, we have to start with the sad news that UK column has, I think, upset a few people.
Well, we did get a few comments following Friday's programme. This was indicative. And my word, a day like this and the UKC can't do anything else but spoil the moment. They could have waited until Monday to tell us what lurks in the future and just for a change focus on what wonderful opportunities are at the horizon. Just for a change, I could have done with being shown a more rosy future. They've really spoiled the day for me. Now, of course, Brian, we weren't intending to spoil anybody's day. But what we were hoping to do is perhaps inject a little bit of realism into the discussion.
And I think the weekend actually proved that, Mike, because I was just astonished at some of the comments that came up. What were a few of them? A lady who runs a shop told me that she'd had mothers in with their children, where the mothers with young children, where the mothers were saying, my goodness, what is going to happen to my children as a result of a leave vote? People saying that the atmosphere at work following the vote was toxic, poisonous. So all sorts of things going on showing that this referendum has been extremely toxic and divisive. And we're going to say, of course, that's what it was designed to do. So do we shy away from telling people the truth, or do we say, we're going to tell you the truth and then you have to deal with it? I think that's our approach.
Well, the question is truth starting to appear in the mainstream? I believe this was a cartoon in the Telegraph, thanks to whoever sent that through to us. You know, we were saying from the beginning that both sides of this argument were controlled, that it was a psychological operation, that it wasn't genuine. And certainly this cartoon sums up an awareness, perhaps, a coming awareness amongst people within the media establishment that was the case.
Right, but I have to ask the question, Mike, in them pushing it out, is that actually designed to help inflame people and destabilise the situation further?
Very good question. In the meantime, actually, a lot of people are focusing on George Osborne and the fact that he disappeared for a few days. Nobody really is giving the same criticism to Theresa May, and she did exactly the same. In fact, her entire demeanour right the way through the campaign was pretty low key, and as a result, she's being touted as a safe pair of hands, a unity leadership candidate. But anyway, Osborne stuck his head above the parapet today and really saying it's all right, don't worry, we're in control. He's echoing the remarks that Mark Carnage made last week. It will not be plain sailing in the days ahead, he says, but let me be clear, you should not underestimate our resolve. We are prepared for the unexpected and we're equipped for whatever happens. And we're determined that, unlike 8 years ago, our financial system will help our country deal with any shocks and dampen them. So that's good. We can all sleep safe in our beds now.
Well, I've always slept safely knowing that George Osborne was in control.
Yes. So the media, of course, telling us that the pound has hit a new low. They're trying to tell us that this is a bad thing. And of course, some voices making the point that it's not really such a bad thing after all, because, of course, it helps British trade. And this is one of a number of sort of, actually, we're doing pretty well if we're outside the EU, articles in the mainstream press, opinion pieces. This one saying success will not be about centralized command and control bureaucracies. The reaction of the financial markets to Britain's decision to leave the EU was telling. Sterling fell sharply, but gilt yields actually rallied, and the FTSE 100 closed the day one of the better performing equity markets in the world. Instead, the locus of pain was peripheral Europe. Bond yields in Greece, Italy, Spain, and Portugal rose, reviving fears of the doom loop, whereby undercapitalized banks prop up over-indebted governments, and so on. And certainly in a lot of the coverage today, a lot of the doom and gloom coverage regarding the financial system, it's been the banks in particular that have been hit the hardest today.
Yeah.
So we watch this with interest. And of course, trade, we can't mention trade without TTIP. And this is the French government now saying, the French Prime Minister saying no to TTIP.
Screen,
oh, sorry, I do apologise. Yes, thank you. Right, so TTIP doesn't respect EU interests, and so the French Prime Minister saying no. I just wanted to put this up really just to remind everybody that TTIP exists because it has hardly been mentioned in the last few months. And just to ask the question once again, if Article 50 or whatever mechanism is finally decided on to get us out of the European Union, if that is ever actually invoked, will TTIP negotiations continue or will they not? If civil servants and government ministers continue to negotiate on TTIP, then I say once again, there is no intention that we should ever leave the European Union.
And we can start to investigate the control of the City of London over the whole affair, whether it's Westminster or the European Union.
Now, before the vote, Patrick Henningsen had said that post the referendum vote, the political landscape would be entirely changed, and that is indeed exactly what has happened. And of course, the attack on Corbyn continues with more and more people resigning. Lucy Powell resigned today, and she said it's absolutely not a planned coup.
Which means it's absolutely a planned coup.
Absolutely. The Telegraph, well, they're saying, giving us all the opportunity to have our say on the Tory and Labour chaos. And I just thought the language was interesting in this. They tweeted this out earlier. We want to know what you have to say about the brave new world politics has entered. So clearly invoking Huxley there. It's just interesting, isn't it, that they should choose that particular phrase?
It's like a sort of broadcast message to people out there that they're heading for the brave new world, which I think they are.
And the question on everybody's lips, perhaps, is, was the entire thing orchestrated in some way? And perhaps, just perhaps, this gives us a clue. David and Samantha Cameron took out a mortgage 8 days before the EU referendum on their property in London. And so Cameron clearly had no idea that he was intending to resign and that he wouldn't be occupying number 10 Downing Street anymore.
And he wasn't distracted by the up-and-coming referendum. That wasn't weighing heavily on his political mind. But perhaps that explains the expression on Samantha Cameron's face. We'll talk about that later.
Right. And I just also wanted to highlight this article from the Telegraph. The establishment needs to get a grip and work out how to stop the country from falling apart. This is from Juliet Samuel. And I just want to say to Juliet, again, you have got to consider the possibility that perhaps the intention, the policy, is to cause the country to fall apart.
Yeah.
And if you don't consider that possibility, if your worldview is so narrow that you consider any such suggestion mere conspiracy theory, then you're never going to understand what it is that's going on around you.
At that point, perhaps we bring in David Ellis. We've discussed quite a few little points there, David. What's your take on events, and what, in particular, what's the reaction from Westminster amongst the great and good that you come into contact with?
Well, we're seeing certainly consistency in that those that are talking of division and upset are clearly the enemy. There isn't any division. Trade will carry on regardless. This issue is about governance, and unfortunately, we have a construct here where, as you've mentioned, that a lot of these sort of personalities at the perceived top end of the Tory echelon are missing in action. That's exactly the case. And as a good barometer as to just really what's going on, take a look at these people's Twitter feeds. Look at the majority of them that are up that end of the tier. Take a look at some of the people that were in Vote Leave, Matthew Elliott and co. Look at their Twitter feeds. Look at Penny Mordaunt's Twitter feed, and Keeley. Look at Oliver Letwin's Twitter feed, and that will give you a good idea of just exactly what the situation is, because a lot of them look like an episode of The Archers, not a proper debate about our governance for this country. And frankly, I'm absolutely outraged that we keep seeing from the mass media this talk of division, and there isn't any division. The issue is, how do we want to live? Do we want to live in a democratic system or not? And I'm reassured by this by Dr. Paul Craig Roberts in America. If you're not on his mailing list, get on it. He is putting out some fantastic analysis on just exactly where we are at the start of this process. The Brexit vote has merely given the country the opportunity to debate and talk about how we wish to be ruled. And clearly, obviously, the country does not want to be ruled by a single point control system that's unelected in Brussels or wherever. So, that's the key thing for everybody to look at here. Now's the time to get your finger out, get out there and start actually getting to where we want to be. So challenge your MP, whoever they are, regardless of party. And of course, what we're seeing more than anything is that it really doesn't seem to matter which party these people are in, because the control point is the same. And I'm reassured by this by Kate Hoey, and I'm certainly reassured by all the face-to-face interface I've had with MPs in Parliament and Lords, that this is exactly the case. We've all got to do our bit, and we've all got to play our part, precipitate and participate.
Okay, right. Well, what we thought we'd do is sort of take people through a snapshot of who has said what in relation to the EU and the referendum, and what's taken place over the last couple of days. We're then going to lead through into matters to do with the European military, which of course is a specialist area for you, David. So let's just have a look at some of the things that have been said. This was going back a few months ago, but David Cameron came out with his famous One Nation, One United Kingdom talk. And what we pointed out is that basically this man was talking about our nation, and we didn't get the feeling it was the nation of the British or the general public. It was almost like it was a little club. But he said, I want to bring our country together, our United Kingdom together, not least by implementing as fast as we can the devolution that we rightly promised. And down the bottom, Nick Robinson from the BBC said, in relation to this article, personal triumphs for David Cameron and Nicola Sturgeon will not just reshape British politics, but perhaps reshape the future of the United Kingdom itself. And certainly we're seeing this, aren't we? Because at the moment, and I take your point, David, but at the moment we've got a country which is completely rudderless because the government doesn't know which direction it's going in, or perhaps it does. But people are in general confused. Perhaps we might ask the question about the referendum itself, because we pointed out that in Cameron's own Witney constituency, this remarkable man, Dave Barmby, who we've interviewed, but basically he said that the documents all show that going back into the 1975 referendum, 66 voted to stay in. And that was a swing of an unlikely 330%. And what he was talking about was that, in fact, the nation was overwhelmingly against coming out, but all sorts of dirty tricks by the government pushed the Remain vote until that result was watered down. So basically they got in, but the result was watered down. And his view is that exactly the same dirty tactics have been used in this latest referendum. And I have to say, I'll do it as a personal opinion. My opinion is that we only saw a fraction of the real out vote. This had to be pushed towards a almost consensus, sorry, not a consensus,
a 50-50.
A 50-50 split in order for the government to still have some sort of control. David, what is your opinion on that? Do you think that the referendum itself was realistic?
Well, I think it started with the greatest of intentions, but of course, as it's gone along, it's become more and more removed from talking about the principal issues. And there are only two precise sort of components to full political union, which means single point control for whoever that is. Now, whether some people are saying that that's banking control, or whether this is control from another point, but nonetheless, the intentions were that we would have this debate, and fair enough, we've done it. And I think there's been such a massive groundswell within the country that Britain wanted to govern itself. It wanted Parliament to be the checkpoint answerable to the people. Now, where this has become more and more complicated is, of course, is that the construct within and the hierarchy within Vote Leave was predominantly conservative. So regardless of whether your political party, I think it's pretty clear now that party politics is in a dreadful state. That when challenged by very senior military officers of good standing and good service who practice in this field, were rebutted by Vote Leave to discuss or put into the campaign the vital components. So there was a refusal from Vote Leave to actually engage on the component forms that the people needed to know about and understand. So what we're seeing there is more of the same control. And this frankly has not been helpful. It's not talked about the things that needed to be talked about. And this is absolutely linear with my personal interface with MPs and Lords in Parliament, and that they refuse to discuss the key issues. One, of military union, and two, of ultimately what the financial union with currency would ultimately come hand in glove at some stage to then get the full political union. Now, at that point, of course, Parliament is moribund. It ceases to exist. And the debate is about the MPs doing their job to uphold their oath and their obligation to the electorate. So we've got the conflict between serving the people, regardless of their party. Their job is to serve the people, not to serve corporate interests or a bank or banks. These are two very separate issues. And this is the conflict, So if there's a divide, then perhaps that is the divide. The people, I do not believe, are divided. They just want to get on.
Yeah. Well, let's follow on from that, because, of course, Mike Robinson here consistently said the vote would be out. Why? Because that enabled this cabal in Westminster to do all sorts of things. So if we just put some of those pieces together, Brexit central, well, we've got David Cameron stands down the moment we've got a vote to leave. And what is that going to do? Well, it's already starting to delay the whole process, because nothing can happen until there's a Conservative conference. We're going to say that's all part of the psychological operation. He's got his chum, Boris Johnson. Well, supposedly they disagree, but we've now got the BBC reporting that Boris Johnson has calmly said, well, of course, the referendum, it was a bit indecisive, Mike. It wasn't quite a clear result. And in any case, he's promising actually closer EU cooperation now that we've had a leave vote.
Yes.
So we're going to label that as a psychological operation on the nation. And then we've got Theresa May. And as Mike has already said, she went very, very quiet. We didn't see her at all during the referendum campaign. Now she's suddenly broken cover as the safe Prime Minister candidate. But if you look at what this woman has done, she's consistently worked to install and integrate EU security arrangements and policing in UK. So safe, likeable woman? I don't think so. I think she's very dangerous. Psychological operation there.
Somebody asked earlier, asked earlier if she was to become the Prime Minister, would that encourage votes towards a female president?
Well, it could well be. I do mention this it's in a minute.
All right,
on a slide, because I think it's a very good point. But Theresa May, quiet, well-dressed, respectable lady. Look at the state surveillance empire that she's built up. Unbelievably dangerous. So Corbyn, we popped on screen there. what's happening now? Well, he's going to be attacked because this man has clearly ruffled feathers. So we've now got this massive campaign. We don't like Corbyn. There's going to be a coup. If it's a coup, it's planned. That's part of the PSYOP as well. And I'll just add, of course, if Labour's destroyed, we're in a one-party state, aren't we?
Yep.
George Soros, well, this brings in Dave Ellis's point about the money people. So he's been bigging up Britain's advantages to being in the EU and at the same time threatening to cause financial chaos if a Brexit occurs. That's got to be a psychological operation. And of course, we need the BBC because their reporting has just been astonishing. On Friday, I think it was Radio 4, had a whole programme which was literally, we didn't do enough to support the EU. It was quite astonishing. Radio 2, I heard yesterday afternoon announcing that Parliament was sovereign. So that's a lie. So this has got to be a PSYOP ongoing every day. Well, we're missing one, and this is the what's it card, isn't it? The wild card, Sadiq Khan, the London mayor, where we've now got calls to make London an independent EU city-state. And of course, Mike, you have talked about that for many, many months, and we have several very good articles on the UK Column website saying that this is ultimately the plan. You put these pieces together, this is not an ordinary referendum. There's something very, very dirty and nasty going on here. Who's the main man? Just before I bring David back in again. Well, let's remember David Cameron. Somebody kindly pointed this out to me, that he'd been sat there with two of his other chums. On the EU blackboard at the back, apparently the EU priorities were to break up the UK. Well, that's been achieved. Create hatred and violence in UK. That's well on the way. Create financial chaos. Do you think that's to come, Mike?
Absolutely.
And of course, they're going to deny with their mouths the work of their hands. But what was actually being discussed here is that Angela Merkel had got a little upset that the French didn't want to give David his bonus. He'd completed most of his tasks. Don't be mean, let him have his bonus. And Francois was swayed by the lovely Angela Merkel and her eyes. He said, who can resist you when your eyes sparkle like that? The boy can have his lolly. So there's David looking like a little schoolboy between the two of them. But of course, he has done the dirty work. He is breaking up Britain, which helps the French and the Germans. And we better bring in Sam Can, because of course she's been in the wings the whole way through. This was a BBC report. Cameron to quit as UK votes to leave the EU. Well, she said, oh, David, how will we survive financially? She obviously knew about the mortgage at that stage. Yeah. We won't be like those awful, ignorant, poor people who voted leave, will we? But there was a voice from the wilderness which said, David, give me a quick ring because there's quite a well-paid post coming up in the EU. So we won't let him off that easily, because what did he say in this BBC News report? It was my job to undermine Britain, destroy British industry, and decimate the British Armed Forces to help build the greater EU superstate. I've done a great job, and you ignorant peasants should be thankful. And Sam needed the last word. David, just tell them how much you despise them for being British. Who cares anyway? We'll have the Brussels job in a few weeks. So, David, do you think I'm being a little bit unkind on Britain's Prime Minister? To me, the man is just disgusting.
Well, kindness is not a word that even a good few Tory MPs that I've met that would use with regard to Cameron and his cabal. You're quite right with your analysis that that it is a very tactical delay. We're delaying with getting on with the job, and that's no good. And it's certainly no good for the entire topography of how we need to get on. I mean, the only thing we can say about the current vote leave framework is that it's made an awfully good job of, perhaps, can we say, laying the ground for a general election. So there seems to be a lot of chatter that this is going to be the case. So if that was, it would now make sense as to why they've played it like they've played it. But with regard to Cameron's administration, so this is Mr. Osborne as Chancellor and Mr. Letwin as head of policy, and seems to be head of everything else, is that what can we say? They have borrowed an enormous amount of money continually through their term in office. And if we were to judge them on just how much money they had contributed into the Crown coffers, which is what they're supposed to be doing, so that we can all get on, all the people in this country can get on. There'd be a tramp on Hyde Park Corner with £1 in his pocket, and he would be how many trillion pounds richer than the government of Britain?
Yeah. Well, this financial bit is one that we have to dig ever deeper into. So I haven't expressed that very well. But basically, money is everything. Follow the money trail, and we're going to be well on the way to finding out what's really happening in UK. Mike, you did lead quite nicely on that one. Let's bring in Theresa May. Here she is. All of a sudden, she's going to emerge as the Stop Boris candidate. And somebody did point out to me that, of course, we were heading for danger with Hillary Clinton, Angela Merkel and Theresa May as possibly a government. So we just mentioned a little bit of hubble bubble on a blasted heath, the three girls for a new world order, really.
Yes.
Yes.
Not much more to say.
No, there isn't.
It's a dangerous scenario.
So let's remember the quality of our MPs, because Chris Bryant, MP, was getting a little bit unhappy that the Labour Party had been wrecked, and he blames Ed Miliband. And he was going to call him a teapot, well, a tea, 3-star pot. But let's just remember who Chris Bryant is. Here's Chris Bryant, the man who thought it was a good thing to be photographing himself in his white Y-fronts for partners over the internet. No shame, nothing. Good common purpose leader there, calling somebody else a teapot. And we've got this man, Hilary Benn. Who is he? Just son of Tony Benn. So he's an anybody, but he's out to get Corbyn. And I'm going to say this is one of the men we need to lawfully clean out of Westminster in our clean-up. BBC we had in the wiring diagram. And here they said, whatever else he achieved during his 6 years in power, David Cameron will forever be remembered as the Prime Minister who took Britain out of the European Union. Well, it's an utter lie, isn't it? I can hear you laughing there, David. Do you want to comment on that one?
Well, he flatly refused to do that, didn't he? I'm sorry, he was campaigning for completely the opposite. So, no, that is just a complete nonsense. Utter nonsense.
It's complete and utter nonsense. And it gets... Sorry, wait a minute. I'm having trouble there. That's the one I would like. Here we've got something. Here's the Khan one, because the Russia Today was reporting that tens of thousands of people were calling for London to be made an independent state within the EU. This is what it's all about, and I'm going to say this is what the immigration is about, because the aim of the immigration is to cynically use the suffering of people to skew the vote. And of course, London has had a huge change in population. That hasn't been done for the good of Londoners or the benefit of the immigrants. The reason those people were wanted is because the cross-party cabal was relying on the fact that if enough immigrants came into the capital city, the vote could be skewed to form this new political viewpoint.
I'm just going to say in our defence, promote us a little bit here, because we have been talking about this global governance agenda aside from the European Union. The European Union exists, obviously. It is there. It is a single point of dictatorship, shall we call it? But under the surface has been this drive for global governance in many, many forms, including the city-states and the regional states. And of course, these are being promoted as being elected mayors and regimes run under an elected mayor. And they're being promoted as bringing democracy down to the local level. But we've been warning about what this actually means in much of what we've written and spoken about.
Which is the exact opposite to what they say.
Exactly. So this is hugely dangerous. And while it's right to keep a focus on the European Union. We can't keep a focus on the European Union alone. We've got to see what the larger policy agenda is and deal with it appropriately.
Yeah. And I'll just say, interesting that the Express had quite a big article attacking David Icke. I think it's worth mentioning because you say, wow, what's happening here? Well, of course, what they were doing is attacking him, that his analysis of how immigration had been cynically used, well, they tried to poo-poo it and say it was all to do with UFOs and aliens and other things. However, the analysis was correct. The analysis is that immigration has been used as a political weapon to help break down society in UK. And of course, the people who have been moved in mass numbers, are victims themselves. This is the key thing to get into. So I think it's significant that the Express seems to be so frightened by analysis over the internet in particular that they're having to try and refute it with a pretty crass article. You don't need to go far to see what's going on. Let's look at this statement from Boris. Here it is in BBC. Johnson pledges EU cooperation after referendum result. There he is, smug look on his face. He's off to have a drink with his chum, David Cameron, I should think. What did he say? Well, he said that basically that the UK will continue to intensify cooperation with the EU following the country's vote to leave. That is exactly what UK column has been warning about. And then he says that basically, well, it was a 52-48 result, well, it wasn't entirely overwhelming. So that's the foot in the door too.
So he's basically not convinced?
No, we probably need to have another referendum to get the right answer. And we're going to remind people that, of course, in the background, who is really benefiting from trouble inside the UK? Well, Germany is certainly doing very well. And Germany here, this was from a few days ago, hitting out at NATO warmongering. But of course, what's the other side of this coin? That if Germany attacks NATO, they can actually be spinning in favour of the EU military. So this was the man, Steinmeier, who was the German foreign minister that was talking about this. But just remember, of course, Germany immensely powerful within the EU military structure. And then we've got Moody's. BBC instantly on the case that Moody's was downgrading Britain's credit rating on the back of the referendum, to which I said, who is Moody's? Well, they're just a £3.5 billion organisation feeding off the back of the banks, feeding off the back of the people. So why does the BBC need to promote them? And then we can come to Mr. Soros, of course, who's been reporting that Britain is mad to leave the European Union. He recommended we stay, and with a carrot and stick approach said if we didn't stay, things were going to go very badly for us. But look in his article, we can just underline it here. It says, the Leave campaign exploited the deteriorating refugee situation, symbolised by frightening images of thousands of asylum seekers concentrating in Calais, desperate to enter Britain. This is the very policy that his Bilderberg colleagues have created. So sheer hypocrisy. Who is Project Syndicate that's had this? Well, go on, have a look, because out of nowhere they've come to be a global reporting empire. Why do they do it? It began in the 1990s as an initiative to assist newly independent media in post-communist Central and Eastern Europe. So it smells a bit of Soros anyway. Sorry, let's have a look here. That's some of the detail. Check it yourselves. But who's funding it in the background? We've got this one.
Bill and Melinda Gates, then.
And the European Climate Foundation, and a Middle East one, which we haven't had a look at, but I think I know we're going to find Saudi Qatar in there. And we'll highlight that bit. How could this possibly happen that London would become an independent state within the European Union, Mike? It's really astonishing.
But not surprising, because we have been talking about it for months.
We've been talking about it for months, and that brings us nicely onto the fact that, of course, what's happening in the background is all in relation to the military. Somebody sent us a very nice comment here. It said a member of the British Army said 90% of the lads in his unit voted to leave. They voted exit because they do not believe they should be involved in Washington's wars. Said that his unit agreed that the wars are dictated by Washington via Brussels and not the British people. He also said that soldiers were taking their own pen to the ballot box because they only use pencils at the poll, and that could be rubbed out and changed. So some pretty crunchy stuff, and that leads us into what's happening behind the scenes with the ongoing creation of the EU military.
Right, well, I'm going to jump back in time a little bit here because this is November 2015, and this is the annual conference of the European Defence Agency. This was Konrad Bruck, who's Director of Defence for Luxembourg, saying we urgently need to move to a common approach to European defence. And he said we welcome work on a global strategy that would encompass all the tools at our disposal to create a stronger and more secure Europe. We need to become more effective in facing crisis. We have the right tools and structures at our disposal. And then he was followed by Federica Mogherini, who is the High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs. And she said we have potentials in the EU treaties that we have not used yet, but we might do soon. And she's speaking about European defence. But what was interesting about this, at this meeting, she was also describing how it was quite clear that the civilian police would have to be militarised. And this was quite a focus of this meeting. She said that EU treaties have the necessary clauses to create an EU army, and those clauses might be used. And she was followed by Jens Stoltenberg, who said European security is interconnected. It's not something we should do, but something we must do. Well, here is Der Spiegel with an article here talking about Ms. Mogherini. She is producing a new document. It's called, if I can just find it here, it's called Shared Vision, Common Action, A Stronger Europe. And it says the EU wants to increase its cooperation in the foreign and security policy. The cooperation in defence matters must be the norm. We Europeans must assume more responsibility for our security. We must be willing and able to deter, respond to hazards, and to protect us from them. And she says in this document, the EU will systematically encourage cooperation in defence matters and create a powerful European defence industry, which is crucial that Europe can independently decide and act. And she says an annual coordinated review process at EU level to discuss the military spending plans of the member states could lead to greater coherence in the planning process in the defence sector and in the development of skills. And she also says, while NATO is there to protect its members from external attacks, the Europeans must in future be better equipped, trained and organised to act alone if necessary. And before I hand over to David for comment, I'll just remind everybody, of course, that in the NATO Defence Ministers meeting a week and a half or a couple of weeks ago, they were specifically discussing the relationship between NATO and the newly integrated EU military structures. And this is going to be, I believe, based on what was said over that Defence Ministers meeting, one of the features of the upcoming NATO conference in Warsaw. So, Dave, people are still in denial about the EU military, but it's absolutely clear that this just continues to forge ahead as a policy.
That's absolutely correct. In communication this morning with some ex-senior officers in a group, that the conclusion is, of course, that the stalling exacerbates our military problem, and it actually suits the EU. The EU are going to blast ahead with this. They have to. It is vital that they attain military union across the EU zone in order to precipitate with the euro as a currency. They have to have a single point budget, and within that will be defence and defence services. So this is capital budgets. Now, you've already alluded to the key fact here. The EU are going to go shopping and they're going to go shopping from an EU perspective for capital projects and procurement, and they will decide where the money flows to who, and what companies get the orders and what companies don't get the orders. So this is pretty apparent now. We can see the game. It is absolutely out in the open, and yet 99.9% of our MPs are refusing to open up and engage on this issue. Now, I am reassured personally from a former First Sea Lord who told me before the referendum that this was going to happen regardless, and the Brexit vote, one way or the other, would not have the slightest impact on the EU continuing to blast ahead with their vital aspirations to attain their own military, because they need it in order to precipitate with their currency, which has clearly failed across the zone. But it suits them for it to be failed. They can control the majority of Europe with half of the country, well, 3/4 of the countries being bankrupt. You've got to do as they're told. So we'll drip feed you a bit of money. You can build a tank. You can build an airplane. You can build a couple of ships. Now do as you're told. And they're using this mitigation against Russia, which is a complete and utter nonsense. They're using the military as financial gearing. Now, this is a very old formula. The Americans have done it very, very well for quite some time, and they're trying to play leapfrog with the original unresolved grief of Lenin back at the point of the Russian Revolution. And unless somebody's prepared to actually talk about this properly with what's gone on with Russia since the Russian Revolution, and ironically, Lenin was supposed to see the board of the Bank of International Settlements on the night the revolution broke out. Now, Lenin went back home, so it tells you exactly where his loyalties were to his people. And we've gone through this nonsense now. We've ended up with Truman's nuclear blackmail going wrong, and ended up with, what's colloquially referred to as the Cold War. And we still have not changed anything. Nothing has changed. That this unresolved grief is still there. And all it needs is for people to be sensible about this and open up dialogue with Russia and talk to them. And this is nonsense for people to keep politically using them as the leverage for their political agenda or their financial agenda on a military basis, so that they get the gearing to control the budgets and the money. And it's pretty straightforward. We're not playing that game anymore, because there's a huge amount of nuclear weapons at stake. And do we really want to be going up there? Russia have done nothing precipitous as yet. The majority of it has all been the EU, and just utter nonsense being precipitated from Brussels as to how they want to obtain their objective, and they'll do anything in any way to get it.
Dave, one of the things that we've been arguing since the beginning of this process is that no matter the result, there was never any intention for Britain to leave the European Union. And it seems to me that one indication of this, I've mentioned TTIP earlier, but this is another indication. If the intention is to respect the will of the people and take us out of the European Union, then surely today any further moves towards military integration involving the British would stop, and the military would be effectively told to quit what they're doing. Is there any indication of that? And if there is no indication of that, surely this indicates a broader policy that we will continue to be part of the European Union for as long as is necessary.
Well, there's certainly nothing precipitating out that we're gonna halt down that avenue. So it certainly alludes to the control point of policy, and who is controlling policy in Whitehall. So if there was a clear sign that we would Brexit as the vote and as the mandate, that would be halted pretty quickly. And yet, what we're seeing on the European front is an acceleration. Yeah. It's blatantly apparent. We've got Federica Mogherini now talking about going shopping. This is blatant now, and it is in front of everyone, and it's vital. I think with this morale issue that we've got with our forces, it is absolutely vital that all of the servicemen and women stand fast. They have to stand fast. If we weaken the British military any further, it will only serve the European agenda. They have to stay where they are.
David, some very, very important points coming out of this, but the shopping one is so critical because, of course, what it's allowing the European Union to do is get in and take over what is left of the British defence industry. And what is that? British aerospace, I suppose, BAE Systems.
That's right.
So the European Union controls the defence market. We don't need to get into the discussion about whether these defence markets are right or wrong. Let's just stick with the reality of the situation on the ground. They get in, they can control the firms, they control where the contracts go. And of course, if British industry, defence industry, doesn't get those contracts, then our capability is wiped out and the whole of the capability is sucked into Europe and will obviously go principally to German and French firms with some Italian participation and some participation from Eastern European countries who can produce very good military equipment. So this is about an economic takeover, which at the same time destroys Britain's military capability. Do any of these retired senior officers actually understand what is happening?
They're starting to. It's a hard, slow process because a lot of them have been used to, for time, implementing policy as they're instructed as an officer. So this is now a very great step for them to get the other side of the fence and actually look at what the bigger agenda is, how the industry works, how it should work, and who's trying to gear it and go in whatever direction. But you're absolutely correct that, we've seen a big jump in Rolls-Royce shares, with the pound going down, which is a good thing for us nationally. This is not a problem. We're seeing gold skyrocket in price. But the fundamental thing here is that the industry, our British industry, it is vital. Without that as an engine, we're going to go nowhere, and it's being stalled. Now, we're seeing Cameron's government has delayed and delayed and delayed procurement of capital budgets for principal jobs, submarines, ships, frigates, etc., etc. And this, you can clearly see now that the agenda now, we've got even more stalling because, as it stands at the moment, unless the MPs realign and get their finger out quickly, we're going to see an even greater stalling whilst the EU forge ahead. They're carrying on. They're not going to wait. They're not going to wait for us. This is hardball, and it is vital now. And this is a process that we've started today of having to get the officers now to sort of try and lobby as hard as they possibly can for progress to be made. It's interesting that we come back to the first Sea Lord I spoke to before the Brexit campaign started. He said that this would not make the Brexit vote one way or the other would not make a difference, and this is what he's alluding to because the EU were going to carry on regardless, and the risks therefore increased. But principally, our discussions, not just on the shopping front, were relating to nuclear weapons and what was going to happen with Trident and all of the huge capital budgets, and what was going to happen with not just either servicing our current stocks of nuclear weapons and rearming the boats, but what was going to happen with the new generation of nuclear weapons that Oldham Maston are currently working on. So, this is the high-stakes game that we're involved with now, is that if we don't get a grip of this, we're not just going to lose our military, we're going to lose the industry, and we're going to lose our state as we all know it. It's so apparent. And yet, over and over again, can we get the MPs to do something about it? Yeah.
David, very, very serious times. I think key to it is that we all use the right language. What is the problem in Westminster? Treason is the problem, and it's being carried out cross-party. So hopefully some of these senior officers are going to start using the right language in describing what's left of the British government. I think on that note...
We'll mention on that note,
yes,
that you're actually appearing with Ian Crane at 7:30 tonight on Humanity versus Insanity.
Indeed, to discuss in more detail, I think, some of these issues, what's really happening in the country and what we can expect to happen post-referendum, particularly unless we do something about it. So, David Ellis, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for your analysis. We are in deeply troubled times in UK. We need to know the facts before we can take the right action to counter it. Are people going to be saddened by the news as it comes out over the next few days and weeks? Absolutely. Chin up. Let's get on with the job. Thanks very much for joining us. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.